When Queen Camilla leaned down to whisper something to little Princess Charlotte, she had no idea Catherine's eyes were fixed on them, and what followed sent shockwaves through the room. It was supposed to be just another polished spring weekend on the royal calendar, carefully timed, packed with obligations, and set against the grand backdrop of Windsor Castle. But Catherine couldn't shake a gnawing feeling deep inside her, and she had learned long ago to never ignore her instincts when it came to her children. Charlotte wasn't acting like herself that morning. She wasn't sulking, she wasn't upset, she was simply quiet, too quiet. The child who usually lit up every room was suddenly shrinking into the background, and it set alarm bells ringing in Catherine's mind. The luncheon was being held in Camilla's honor, celebrating one of her latest charitable patronages. But the guest list made things tense. It wasn't just William and Catherine's close circle. Camilla had invited her own allies, blending them in with the wider royal family. The atmosphere was polite, but icy undertones crackled beneath the surface. Prince William managed to glide through the event with ease, smiling and charming like always. But Catherine stayed sharp, her gaze sweeping every corner. She knew the royal stage was never truly safe. Not for her, and definitely not for Charlotte. By tradition, Charlotte was asked to sit with the younger cousins in one of the smaller salons. The children were expected to sip their tea, chatter sweetly, and keep up appearances. Catherine personally walked her daughter in, fixed her collar, kissed her forehead, and gave one last protective glance. At that moment, nothing seemed wrong. But behind closed doors, everything was about to change. Around 45 minutes into the luncheon, Catherine was mid-conversation with a senior courtier when she suddenly caught sight of Charlotte slipping past one of the open doors down the corridor. The little girl wasn't in tears, but her face said everything. Lips pressed tight, eyes clouded with hurt. It wasn't the sting of a scraped knee, it was the kind of wound that cut straight to the heart. Without a second thought, Catherine excused herself and followed. She found Charlotte standing at the far end of the hallway by a service door, hands clasped nervously in front of her, eyes fixed on the floor like she was holding back a storm. "What happened, darling?" Catherine asked softly. Charlotte hesitated before whispering, "Nothing, Mummy." But Catherine crouched low, locking eyes with her daughter. "Sweetheart, I can tell when something's wrong." And finally, the truth spilled out. In a barely there voice, Charlotte confessed, "Granny Camilla said I was showing off. She told me not to speak unless I was spoken to." Catherine froze, her breath catching. "When did she say that?" she pressed. Charlotte explained it was just moments earlier, when she had given Louis the answer to a guessing game. "But she got annoyed," Charlotte added quietly. Catherine hugged her tight, her face calm, but her insides burning. She had always played the polite dance with Camilla, biting her tongue when those veiled barbs slipped out. Camilla had her own rigid views on hierarchy, always disguised with a smile but sharpened with a tone that cut when she wanted it to. Still, Catherine never imagined that icy edge would be turned on her child. She was wrong. Later that day, as the family strolled the castle gardens, Camilla walked ahead beside Charles, laughing and chatting as if the morning's tension had never even happened. Catherine's eyes stayed locked on Charlotte, and the truth hit her hard. It wasn't just Camilla's words. It was the way her daughter felt she had to retreat, to shrink herself down and hide. After the garden stroll, the families regrouped inside for refreshments, and Catherine made it her mission to quietly observe every detail. It didn't take long. At the side table, Charlotte reached for a second scone, a perfectly innocent gesture for a child. Camilla turned, gave her that practiced half smile, and in a voice laced with sugar said, "One is enough, darling. We don't want to appear greedy." The jab landed like a dart. Catherine caught it instantly, and this time there was no denying it. This wasn't just a slip of the tongue. These were patterns. Tiny, carefully masked digs aimed at the same child again and again. Alone, they might seem harmless. Together, they painted a picture that Catherine could no longer ignore. She didn't flare up in public. That wasn't her way. But her silence had always been a weapon. And deep down, she knew it was time to use it. William, meanwhile, was blissfully unaware, chatting away with Charles and senior aides about schedules and duties. Catherine said nothing. Not yet. She was saving it. That evening at Adelaide Cottage, she would finally tell him what she had seen with her own eyes. But before she could even reach that moment, another incident unfolded. Catherine had entered royal life knowing it demanded sacrifice. The heavy crown of duty, the endless unwritten rules, the balancing act between public smiles and private truths. But there was one line she swore would never be crossed. No one was allowed to make her children feel small. And just as the tea was cleared and the adults shifted into the sitting room off the main gallery, an old tradition from the late Queen's era, the children were brought in briefly before their nannies escorted them upstairs. Charlotte walked in alongside George and Louis, her face calm but guarded, and quietly settled by the fireplace with a book she plucked from the shelf. For a moment, she looked content, flipping pages while the chatter of the room carried on. Then Camilla swept in, glass of water in hand, laughter trailing behind her as she whispered with one of her longtime aides. Her mood seemed almost carefree, at least until her eyes fell on the children. She offered them a passing smile, then turned her focus back to the adults. But within minutes, the mood shifted. George and Louis drifted naturally toward their grandfather, eager to hover by Charles, while Charlotte stayed tucked into the armchair. A beat later, her small voice broke the air. "May I play the piano for a bit?" she asked politely. Camilla turned slightly, arching a brow. "The piano?" she repeated. "Yes, just quietly," Charlotte explained. Camilla sipped from her glass, then cut in, her tone wrapped in honey but edged with steel. "Darling, that's not necessary. Let the grown-ups enjoy some peace. Why don't you sit still like a proper young lady?" It wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted. But it hit like a slap. The sharpness in her words made Charlotte's cheeks burn red. She lowered her gaze, shut her book without a sound, and folded her hands neatly in her lap. Silenced. Catherine heard every word. She had been standing just a few feet away, locked in conversation with Lady Lansdowne, but her eyes snapped to her daughter instantly. Then they lifted to Camilla. For a brief, cutting second, their stares locked. Catherine unflinching, Camilla glancing away. The room carried on, voices rising again as though nothing had happened, but the energy was different now. Later that night at Adelaide Cottage, the silence of the house felt heavy. William was finishing up a late call, George already fast asleep. Catherine sat gently on the edge of Charlotte's bed, smoothing the blanket, and asked softly, "Did you feel upset today?" Charlotte hesitated, her voice small. "I'm okay." Catherine shook her head gently. "You don't have to pretend, sweetheart." Slowly, Charlotte nodded. "Granny Camilla doesn't like when I talk too much there." The words were simple, but they hit like a blow. No confusion, no exaggeration, just truth from a child's lips. Catherine kissed her forehead, tucked the blanket tighter, and slipped out into the hall. As she passed the study, William looked up from his desk. "Is she all right?" he asked, concern written on his face. "She's trying to be," Catherine answered quietly. William leaned back, bracing himself. "What happened?" Catherine told him everything, not in anger, but in chilling detail. She repeated Charlotte's confession, then laid out what she had witnessed. Camilla's pointed remarks, the cold dismissals, the way she seemed intent on dimming Charlotte's light. William stayed silent until the very end, his expression hardening. Catherine's voice steadied as she said, "This isn't something we let slide." His reply was firm. "I agree, but we must handle it carefully." The next morning, Catherine made her move. She requested that Charlotte skip her next scheduled appearance, a children's garden project Camilla had arranged, blending royal cousins for the cameras. Catherine gave the official excuse of a minor cold, but in truth, she wasn't about to let Charlotte be placed in that space again. Not until she knew it was safe. When word reached Camilla, her only visible reaction was the arch of a brow. Then, under her breath, she reportedly muttered, "Probably too delicate for a little mud." That remark, of course, made its way back to Catherine, because inside palace walls, whispers travel faster than the truth. The matter might have stayed quiet, brushed under the rug as so many things are, if not for what happened the very next weekend. Charles extended an invitation for a small, private dinner at Highgrove. Just William, Catherine, and himself. The plan was supposed to be simple. The plan at Highgrove had been simple. Spend time as a family, share dinner, and chat about upcoming royal tours. But the moment Catherine entered the main lounge with Charlotte, who had come only to kiss her grandfather goodnight, the air turned icy. Camilla was seated by the fire, glass of wine in hand, her laughter fading as Charlotte stepped inside. The little girl offered a polite smile and said sweetly, "Good evening, Granny." Camilla barely glanced up. With a tilt of her head, she replied, "Are you sure you're not too tired to be here?" It was a jab dressed as concern, but the sting was clear, and every adult in the room heard it. Catherine's eyes fixed on Camilla, and this time she wasn't waiting until later. The polite mask she wore upon entering vanished, replaced by a calm intensity that shifted the entire mood. She bent to Charlotte and said softly, "Why don't you say goodnight to Grandpa and head upstairs with Anna?" Charlotte looked uncertain, glancing up at her mother, but Catherine's steady nod gave her confidence. She hugged Charles quickly, then left with the nanny. The door clicked shut, and silence fell like a hammer. Camilla swirled her glass lazily, then muttered under her breath, "Well, she's very sensitive, isn't she?" William froze. Charles shifted uncomfortably, but Catherine stepped forward, her voice steady, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. She's not too sensitive. She's a child, and she deserves to be spoken to with kindness." Camilla arched a brow, feigning innocence. "I didn't mean it that way. I was just surprised she's still awake at this hour. Hardly something to get upset about." Catherine didn't blink. Her voice cut sharper. "It isn't just tonight. This has been happening for weeks. I've heard it. And so has she." The room chilled. Charles attempted to step in, fumbling, "Darling, perhaps we should all just—" But Catherine didn't let him finish. Still calm but firm as stone, she replied, "If it were just one comment, we'd move on. But it's not one comment. It's a pattern," Catherine said firmly. "And I won't stand by while my daughter is made to feel less than." Camilla's eyes flicked to William, expecting him to jump in, but he stayed silent. That silence alone spoke louder than any defense he could have given. "I've worked hard to keep the peace," Catherine continued, her tone steady but cutting, "because that's what's expected of me. I've let things slide that didn't sit right. But this is different. This is about Charlotte. And I will not let anyone, no matter who they are, chip away at her confidence." Camilla set her glass down with a sharp clink and leaned forward. "You're reading too much into this. You always take everything so seriously. Children are resilient." Catherine's expression never shifted. Children remember how they're spoken to, especially by the people who are supposed to protect them. Her words landed heavy, without theatrics or raised volume. The quiet strength of a mother drawing a line in the sand. William finally spoke, his voice low but resolute. "We're asking for something very simple. Respect. Charlotte hasn't done anything wrong. She's just being herself. That should never be a problem." Camilla turned to Charles, almost pleading for backup, but he remained silent. His discomfort was clear, yet he knew better than to interfere. Catherine had claimed the ground, and once she did, there was no undoing it. The room froze in that tense silence until Catherine calmly excused herself. William followed, leaving Camilla and Charles in the heavy quiet of the lounge. Upstairs, Catherine sat once more at Charlotte's bedside. But this time, she didn't ask gentle questions. She simply held her daughter's hand and whispered, "You did nothing wrong. You were polite, you were kind, and that's all I'll ever ask of you." Charlotte's eyes lifted, watery but strong. "I tried to be." Catherine squeezed her hand and said softly, "You don't have to try to be perfect." Catherine bent close to her daughter's ear and whispered, "You just have to be you." Downstairs, Charles tried to steer the evening back to safer topics, fumbling over light conversation. Camilla, however, said almost nothing. She didn't apologize, but she didn't challenge Catherine again either. Her silence was loaded, and everyone in the room felt it. Later that night, back at Adelaide Cottage, Catherine sat with William in their room. Her voice was calm but heavy with exhaustion. "She doesn't have to like me," Catherine admitted, "but she will treat Charlotte with respect. That's non-negotiable." William nodded firmly, "And she will, because we're not letting this continue." The following days played out politely enough, but a shift had settled like a shadow. At Charlotte's school recital at Lambrook, Catherine made a pointed choice. Only immediate family were invited. Camilla's absence was explained away publicly as a scheduling conflict, but insiders knew better. Behind the palace's glossy photographs of unity, cracks were widening. At official events, Camilla kept her distance from Charlotte. No more comments, no pointed looks, At least, not within Catherine's reach. The message had been received. Catherine had drawn her boundary. And in a family built on centuries of hierarchy and silent obedience, some lines could not be crossed without consequence. But this was not the end. Camilla had taken the warning, yes, but she hadn't forgotten. And when the family gathered later that summer at Balmoral, everything shifted once again. Balmoral had always been Charles's sanctuary, a place to breathe away from the cameras, a landscape still echoing with the late Queen's presence. Tradition demanded the family gather there every summer. But this year, under the clear Scottish skies and quiet hills, the atmosphere carried something different, an undercurrent of tension that promised the storm wasn't over. Catherine had agreed to Balmoral, but on her terms. She and William brought all 3 children as tradition demanded, but Catherine made it clear to her husband, Charlotte would never be left alone with Camilla, not even for a moment. Charles was the first to greet them at the estate, arms open, warmth spilling across his face. He adored his grandchildren, his joy at seeing them unmistakable. A day later, Camilla arrived. Entourage in tow, wardrobe carefully curated, every detail calculated. Since the Highgrove clash, she had been uncharacteristically quiet. With Catherine, she kept communication clipped, confined to formal pleasantries in public. Behind closed doors, the silence between them was thick enough to cut. On the surface, Balmoral carried on as it always had. Long walks across the rolling hills, horseback rides under crisp skies, hearty dinners around the old oak table. The children laughed freely, their energy filling the halls. Catherine watched Charlotte closely, and slowly, to her relief, her daughter's spark began to return. She was once again lively at breakfast, darting across the fields with George and Louis, even sneaking into the kitchen to help bake scones with the staff one afternoon. For a while, Catherine allowed herself to breathe. Perhaps this visit would pass without drama. But then came the moment. Catherine was in the drawing room, seated with Lady Sarah Chowdow and a handful of aides, discussing schedules and household details. William had gone fishing with his father. Outside, the children played in the garden under the supervision of 2 staff members. It was the first time since their arrival that Catherine's watchful eyes weren't directly on Charlotte. Barely 5 minutes had passed. An aide leaned close and murmured, "I believe Princess Charlotte is in the sunroom, with Her Majesty." Catherine froze. Her posture stiffened, but her face stayed composed. She didn't rush, yet her heart hammered. With a quiet nod, she excused herself and moved quickly down the corridor. As she neared the sunroom, voices drifted out. One sharp, one small. Camilla's voice carried first. "We don't always need to speak over others, Charlotte. It's important to listen. Sometimes your mummy forgets that too." Catherine stopped cold. Charlotte's silence on the other side of the door made it worse. That was all Catherine needed to hear. She pushed the door open. Camilla looked up, startled. "There you are," she said smoothly. "I was looking for you, darling," Catherine said evenly, her eyes locked on Charlotte. The little girl rose instantly and went straight to her mother's side. "I was only having a word," Camilla remarked, tone light but edged like glass. "I heard," Catherine replied, her voice steady as stone. Camilla lifted a brow. She was only being a child," Catherine cut in, still calm but unwavering. "And she doesn't need to be corrected for speaking. Not every time she opens her mouth." Camilla folded her arms, voice turning cool. "I've raised children. I know when a girl's growing too fast for her own good." "She's growing just fine," Catherine shot back, her tone firm, unflinching. "And she'll do it without being made to feel like a burden. No shouting, no theatrics, just raw clarity. The kind that leaves no space for argument." Catherine's final words cut through the silence. "I'd like a bit more kindness around her. That shouldn't be too much to ask." Camilla didn't answer. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. But Catherine no longer cared. She had spent years protecting the crown. Now, her fight had shifted to protecting her daughter. As she stepped into the hallway, Catherine knelt down, eye level with Charlotte, and said, "You did nothing wrong," Catherine whispered, brushing a tear from Charlotte's cheek. The little girl nodded, though her eyes still shimmered with emotion. Catherine leaned closer. "You never need to be afraid of speaking up, ever. By the end of that week, even palace staff had noticed the shift. Camilla kept her distance at meals, no longer hovering near the children, no longer commenting on their manners, their clothes, or the way they spoke. To the untrained eye, it looked like nothing. But in royal circles, where subtlety is everything, it was monumental. Catherine hadn't screamed. She hadn't staged a public scandal, but she had done something far more powerful. She drew a line, and everyone, even Charles, saw it clearly. He adored both women. And though he had wished the tension would fade with time, he knew better than to interfere. When Catherine stood her ground, it was never without cause. And once she did, there was no undoing it. That summer closed the same way it always did, with the traditional family photographs, smiles frozen for the cameras, a sea of waves to waiting well-wishers. To the public, nothing seemed amiss. But behind those castle walls, something had changed forever. Camilla had lost something without even realizing it. Catherine's tolerance, that quiet willingness to let things slide for the sake of appearances, was gone. And in its place stood a mother who had made a silent vow. Her daughter would never again be made to feel small. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in Catherine's shoes? Do you think Camilla crossed a line? Or was this just a clash of two generations? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you made it this far, sound off below. Do you think this royal feud is truly over, or is the storm only beginning? Make sure to like, share, and subscribe if you want more deep dives like this.